They gifted you sweet armor, legendary weapons, and buffed your abilities for pledging allegiance to them. And in the end, what you actually got was a full-on bloody cult war on your very doorstep. You've probably heard of the Future War Cult or Dead Orbit. But do you know of the Binary Star Cult, Symmetry, Echelon South, or the long-lost 7 Seraphs? And why most of them were thrown out of the last city. In this video I'll explore how they sowed distrust and racism, and even now, it looks like we might see their return in the most unexpected way possible. Welcome to as many mental facts lore and buried histories of secret or lost war cults in Destiny 2. Starting with a lost to time faction you could never join because you were already part of it. The 7 Seraphs, blazing a trail during the Golden Age. They were human agents of the Warmind, led by the AI Rasputin. They dealt in experimental armor and weaponry that we use to this day in the form of the 7th Seraph armor set, Valkyrian armor ornaments, the CQC 12 shotty, the carbine auto rifle, and a 180 officer revolver hand cannon. All absolute solid weapons that I have clogging up my vault right now. In Destiny, they were to be one of the original 5 factions that were given their own pre-alpha logo and headquartered on the Seraph station in Earth orbit. The same Seraph station that Aramis tried to use to take down the Traveler in Season of the Seraph. According to Rob Adams, Bungie's lead world artist for OG Destiny, the 7 Seraphs were a program overseen by the Cosmodrome's higher-ups, who determined where to construct Rasputin's bunker. During the collapse, when the Black Fleet was unleashing their immense gravity weapons upon the Earth and Titan, all human members of the 7 Seraphs were wiped out. But when we joined forces with the newly minted Rasputin during Season of the Seraph, we uncovered their armaments in lost Seraph bunkers and rediscovered their technological legacies, thus becoming the final generation of Seraph agents until Rasputin was lost to deletion at the end of that season. We still carry their legacy. In-game, the faction wars were the very first iteration of PvP mode Crucible, but in lore, it's something very different, and brought a bloodied fight for power to the very doors of the tower and the last city. Lysander had a seat in the government's council, called the Consensus. His faction was called the Concordat, and their goal at that point was to forcefully remove the Speaker of the Traveler and Consensus, and take back all that territory lost in the Battle of 6 Fronts. He took on the forces of the other factions, the Vanguard, and Speaker, and aimed to overthrow the government in a bloody show of force, then step in and rule in its place. This ignited the great faction wars that would have its final showdown in the now Crucible map of Bannerfall. Since then, nearly all references to the Concordat have been removed from the last city, except for banners and logos still adorning the walls of Bannerfall, which can be seen to this very day. In the time following the outcome of the faction wars, an opportunity presented itself to introduce a new member to take a seat in the Consensus and replace the traitorous Lysander. That seat was given to the Future War Cult. It was deep inside Tibet that the Future War Cult found the plans of a device that could predict possible timelines and futures and chart a path through it, not unlike the psychohistories of Asimov's Foundation. It was this device that would be the root cause of the downfall of the cult that existed from the high days of the Golden Age, and for a time, they were a trusted ally of the last city, and of course, the Vanguard. Future War Cult was always built around military strength and defending the last city at all costs. They felt that war with the darkness was inevitable and preparation just needed to start as soon as possible. It was these ideals that drove the experimentation into dangerous Vex technologies that would bring them and the other factions to their knees. Lakshmi, too, led the inner circle of the faction and had a seat with Jalal on the last city council. It was this Lakshmi that was the same failed facsimile of a previous Future War Cult member, Maya Sundaresh, who was secretly smuggled out of New Muna. The same Lakshmi that would be obsessed by the rebuilt Tibetan device that gave her forked mind insight into future events, and she trusted its predictions and portents. But it would be this obsession that would ruin her. Lakshmi's device successfully predicted the Red War invasion, and she had thousands of their warriors ready for it, even though the consensus and the vanguard didn't take her warnings seriously at all. They were ready for what happened, had evacuation routes and safe hideouts outside the city ready to go. They rescued more citizens than all the other factions combined, including the vanguard. If you had chosen the Future War Cult as your faction to join, you would have gotten the sweetest pick of weapons, such as the number a 450 RPM arc auto, which still is very solid in PvP today. Memory interdict, 120 RPM void grenade launcher. The Vision, a 491 RPM arc sidearm. Scholastic variable, 900 RPM arc submachine gun, and 200 RPM Solar Scout Pleiades Corrector, which were all added as Future War Cult weapons not too long ago to Destiny 2, and were one of the few refreshes given to faction weapon offerings since the days of subscribing to factions had passed. Still, now, in the last city, Future War Cult spaces have the nicest, plushest, most advanced setup in the tower, and an entire research lounge where members could look at the data about possible futures from the device sits now abandoned. Cool, clean, and almost Apple-like in design, Dead Orbit was a wealthy, nihilistic cult that would steal pre-Golden Age loot like Van Gogh's paintings to build wealth, to break away from Earth. They never wanted to be in the tower and really only did it for their Guardians champions in the Crucible, who they also had a sponsor title in. It seemed like they were far more comfortable in their shipyards, producing starships to escape the graveyard that was Earth. Their own motto of sorts was, "The Traveller is not our only salvation. Another future lies out among the light of other stars." They were pretty much itching to leave. Members of Dead Orbit intended to escape an already dying Earth before the darkness's return, as they'd given up on the Traveller and put little faith in the city's ability to hold out against a major attack. While they recognized that such a move could be very costly in terms of lives, they couldn't see another alternative for survival, and instead put their faith in finding enough Golden Age technology in vaults and abandoned shipyards to allow them to escape and find a new homeworld out there in the stars. They were even willing to cross New Monarchy's legal authority to achieve this end, but they also knew they would need to bring Guardians to their cause in order to fight against any future threats. Dead Orbit's awoken leader in the form of Arak Jalal had a seat in the consensus, the last city's government council. Someone who came out from the pocket universe of the Awoken, along with Zavala, in the early days of this universe's Awoken. Dead Orbit once also had a good relationship with the Vanguard, as their large fleets of ships proved very useful as scouts and helped evacuate planets soon to be taken by the Witness. After the events of the Endless Night, Jalal took the fleet and the wealth of Dead Orbit and left the last city after the failed overthrow of the Vanguard by New Monarchy and the Future War Cult. He didn't want to be implicated in the actions of other factions and decided to leave before that could happen. As part of their allegiance to the cult, Guardians could get 5 specific weapons such as Haunted Earth Scout, 3 Graves Pulse, Dire Promise Hand Cannon, which is still around, 11th Hour Sidearm from the Viced Gun Foundry, and the Gravity Slingshot Shoddy. I don't think that most other weapons could really stand up to the quality of the Future War Cult's weapon set, since they didn't get the same love from Bungie. Maybe we will see Dead Orbit, new weapon reissues, but who knows. The set of Dead Orbit gear once offered improved resilience for hunters. It boasted improved mobility and resilience on each piece of the set, but none would even touch a Guardian's recovery rate. A new golden age needed to rise, and at the head of this rebirth would be a monarch that would lead in place of a failed military government. Red and white branded colours were plastered all over the weapons and armour offered to Guardians by the new monarchy. Weapons to crush in Crucible. New Monarchy was a staunchly pro-city faction that believed in law and order. They once hoped to rebuild the Golden Age and believe in humanity's ability to overcome their current hardships, while the faction wars may have ended with the establishment of the Consensus. New Monarchy still aimed to position a monarch in charge of the city in place of the currently fragile alliance between factions. In a rags to riches story of sorts, Executor Hideo led New Monarchy and was the vendor we dealt with when gaining reputation with the faction and gaining armour, weapons and buffs. A petty little man that allowed the trappings of power to go straight to his head. One of his roles as Executor was to find the monarch that would ascend to take command of the last city and lead the last of humanity with strength and wisdom. He failed at that too. It was Hideo who forced a teenage Hawthorne from her dad's and fled to the city outskirts after she broke his nose. Executor Hideo offered the Guardian some lackluster legendary weapons as part of the deal to gain reputation for New Monarchy, like the Red Hand 9 legendary hand cannon, the Crusader 1 Scout, Admonisher 3 is a rocket launcher, and also a machine gun, all brandished in the red and white New Monarchy colours, called Prestige 4. In the end, it was the Fist of New Monarchy and the Guardians who pledged themselves to the faction, who were credited for laying the final blow to the traitor Lysander and his Concordat, who sought to overthrow the Consensus and the Speaker at a location of the last city called Bannerfall during these faction wars. The faction wars brought open war to the last city. The Concordat leader was on a crusade that the Vanguard would not stand for. They ordered Lysander to immediately disband his following and faction, and it was this that triggered a series of battles throughout the city between factions fighting for dominance. Lysander took on new and old factions and the city vanguard, with the Speaker looking on from the safety of the Consensus. Shaxx took Bannerfall following the final battle of the faction wars in remembrance of that moment and made it into a Crucible map, as he tends to do. Bannerfall was also the home to the weapon foundry Cruz Lamar and their personalised set of rocket launchers. It was here that the final conflict happened, and it took the might of New Monarchy to bring the entire army down upon the Concordat and exile them right from the last city. Following the Great Battle of Six Fronts, where the Fallen attacked a very new last city, the people were worn from war, and new factions began to pop up with different ideologies, with some violent ways to achieve their goals. While only the main 3 factions allowed for Guardian reputation ranking up, the rest became very loud and made their demands known to the city leaders. Their ways and means concerned the Vanguard and the Speaker. Violent and dangerous, and should be exiled from the last city. This was the determination made by Tallulah Fairwind, the Hunter Vanguard, at that time. It was mainly for this reason that this particular faction were never offered a seat on the consensus. The binary Star Cult held the belief that the Traveller itself triggered the collapse and used humanity as a sacrifice proxy army in its war against the darkness. The faction has never been mentioned by any NPC in the game, never itself made it inside of the game, and is confined to the tomes of lost lore history. A violent sister faction also exiled to lore history is Echelon South, which was a group that grew to popularity in the Last City following the chaos of Six Fronts and destruction of the Iron Lords. We don't know of the leadership, and their membership in general was kept secret. They were responsible for some of the worst bloody incidents of the faction wars and were targeted by the Vanguard to face condemnation and exile for their actions during that time. While some would call the warlock Ulan Tan prolific, he never saw the rise of a faction dedicated to his teachings in his own lifetime. He would also never see that grove on Io dedicated to him either. The faction known as the Symmetry centered their entire teachings around the Ulan Tan, who asserted that the darkness was counterpoint to the light and that all light was interconnected across time and space. Members believed that the Traveller's goodness led it to sacrifice itself to defeat the darkness for their sake, and they must repay the Traveller's goodness by healing it. After Lysander's Concordat was thrown straight out of the tower, the consensus briefly considered elevating the Symmetry in its place before deciding on the future war cult. It was a time where the government put all factions on trial and made a judgment on how worthy they were to stay present in the city. At the time, the Symmetry's followers were growing in number, yet the consensus felt that its philosophy was too dangerous and spread too much fear. Well outside the politics of the Last City and utilising the power of the Vex weapon foundry in the lighthouse, the Cult of Osiris produced some of the best weapons for trials of Osiris at that point in time. More of a religious nut cult than political entity, they were known for their crackpot conspiracies and adoration of Guardian Osiris, even though for many years of the cult none had actually met the man. It was these people that started the trials of Osiris to study the sound that a Guardian made at the moment of their death. They produced weapons that utilised the Vex technology of the lighthouse to entice Guardians to play and die for them many, many times, since Guardians are more than happy to die for loot, as we all know. Led by the blind Brother Vance and Sister Feora, they were not of the city, but based themselves out of the lighthouse in Mercury and later on in the fields of glass overlooking the infinite forest. Saint 14's infamous Perfect Paradox shoddy that raised its head recently was a weapon produced by this forge. What most didn't see was that future war cult's Lakshmi was suffering delusions and cracks of madness directly from the device they had constructed. It had poisoned her mind, and even fractures were appearing in the future war cult, where members had approached Ikora Ray worrying about the future of their leadership. Lakshmi was determined to remove the Elixni House of Light from the Last City using a Vex portal during the Endless Night of Season of the Splicer. She inadvertently triggered a Vex invasion of the Botsu district, which got her killed and pushed New Monarchy to flee just in case they got caught up in the Vanguard retribution that was to come. Although Dead Orbit had nothing to do with this, they jumped into their ships and also fled. What was left of Future War Cult dove into the depths of space, or some even joined the Vanguard. But effectively, it ended the time of factions. While gone, they're not forgotten. The people of the Last City have expressed their unhappiness with the Guardian-led leadership for some time, since it is thought of as only thinking in immortal terms, We know the Vanguard can handle a long view, but we need the short-term perspective as well as the immortal one. It's funny that the Guardian Games have provided a possible return for Lysander of the Concordat, the first faction to attempt a coup that was ran out of the town, so to speak. A donation for the games? Spider said distractedly. Is that unusual? The Concordat are still out there developing technologies for their agenda. Ikora's Hidden have identified that it was this Concordat that offered the Guardian the gift of skimmers for the Guardian Games. In effect, a bribe. In fact, dead orbit weapons and indeed ships have not all left the city, even though their leadership has gone, for now. Even some of the future War Cult's previous members still live in the last city, and their space in the hangar still sits there, waiting for something. Guardian Games are a current iteration of the reputation building mechanics that the factions use to level up and garner weapons and currency for the Guardian. In fact, some of the weapons being offered in the Guardian Games were those weapons offered from now defunct factions. While they may be gone, their influence is still looming large in Destiny 2. Factions had tight associations with weapon foundries and used their weapons as offerings to the Guardian in Destiny and Destiny 2. If you want to learn more about these politics and the corruption of these companies that followed in the last city, check out my video right here.
Wow, this has just been such a pleasure. I'm such a lucky boy. I can't wait to go home and